They tore down my barn. 5 years of hard work wiped out in just 5 minutes, all because it didn't fit their pristine resort aesthetic. My cattle were left stuck in the mud, confused and distressed, while the HOA president grinned like she'd just saved the world from some rural eyesore. She believed a few permits, some pumps, and a designer backyard gave her the power to rewrite the rules of the land. But here's the truth: when you build your fancy kingdom on someone else's roots, don't act shocked when the ground gets messy. Drop a comment if you've ever seen a wedding ruined by muddy chaos, say for all the wrong reasons. I'm Hank Redford. I've called this 10-acre stretch home for 8 years. I bought this property fair and square at a county auction for unused land. Back then, it was nothing but scrub brush, a handful of ancient oak trees, and a rusty fence. But I saw something special. I spent months, every weekend, clearing brush, laying foundations, and slowly building what I proudly named Lucky Cattle Ranch. The crown jewel was my barn, a solid structure housing 30 cattle I'd raised from calves. That barn was 5 years of sweat, hope, and dreams. Every plank, every nail was hammered in with purpose. Through scorching Texas sun and freezing winter mornings when my breath hung in the air like smoke. Then trouble rolled in with the arrival of Willowbrook Resort Estates next door, 200 luxury homes sprouting up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, each one worth more than I'd make in a decade. The neighborhood was filled with wealthy retirees and tech execs who wanted a slice of Texas hill country without any of the real countryside. They craved the picture-perfect sunsets and rolling hills, but heaven forbid they catch a whiff of cow or hear a rooster's crow at dawn. The HOA president, Meredith Callaway, took it upon herself to turn our corner of Austin into a Palm Springs knockoff. A former fashion stylist married into money, Meredith now spent her days flaunting wealth and making sure everyone knew it. That Monday started just like any other. I was up at 5:30, feeding cattle, checking water tanks, and planning out my day. The air was crisp, the kind of Texas autumn morning that makes you grateful to be alive. I was thinking about expanding the south pasture when I heard heavy machinery rumbling nearby. At first, I thought maybe someone was working on one of those fancy houses. But the noise kept coming, getting louder, too close for comfort. I rounded the corner of my house and froze. A huge excavator sat right beside my barn, its yellow arm swinging toward the wooden building I'd poured my heart into. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I shouted, running up to the operator. The burly man in a hard hat killed the engine and climbed down, shoving a crumpled paper at me without looking in my eyes. "Sorry, man," he mumbled. "Got orders to clear this. County says it's a hazard." I stared at the paper, official letterhead, legal jargon, and at the bottom, Meredith Callaway's signature. The demolition order was dated 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. And nobody had told me my barn was about to be torn down. Before I could even process it, Meredith herself appeared, like a vulture circling roadkill, dressed in crisp white linen that probably cost more than my monthly feed bill, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed despite the early hour. "Good morning, Hank," she said, flashing that fake smile rich people use when they're about to ruin your day. "I hope you understand this isn't personal. We're just trying to improve the look of our community. Your barn doesn't fit with our resort vibe." My jaw tightened as I watched 5 years of labor reduced to some legal mumbo-jumbo about resort atmosphere. "Mom," I said, "this is farmland. It's been farmland for 50 years. Her smile didn't falter. "Not anymore." That's when the destruction began. I stood there, powerless, as the excavator's arm swung in wide arcs, smashing my barn to pieces in 5 minutes flat. The sound was gut-wrenching, a splintering wood, twisting metal, and the terrified lowing of my cattle as their shelter crumbled. 30 head of prime Texas beef suddenly had nowhere to go, squeezed into a tiny paddock behind the wreckage. Some of my older cows looked genuinely scared, and I knew I had maybe a day before I'd start losing animals to stress. The operator tore through my barn with machine-like precision until all that was left was a neat pile of debris that would fit in 3 dump trucks. quirks. As I watched my life's work vanish into dust and diesel fumes, one thing became crystal clear: Meredith Calloway had no clue who she was dealing with. She saw a simple farmer, someone beneath her notice, a problem to be fixed with money and legal papers. What she didn't realize was that the man standing in her perfectly manicured shadow was the guy who had spent a decade designing and maintaining every water pipe, drainage ditch, and emergency valve in this whole area. She had just declared war on the one person who could shut down her artificial paradise with the flick of a wrench. The aftermath was worse than I imagined. 30 cattle crammed into a space meant for maybe 10 created chaos that shook everything I'd built. Within 48 hours, 5 of my weaker cows had died from stress and overcrowding. I'd raised these animals from calves. I knew their personalities, their quirks. Watching them suffer because of one woman's ego felt like losing family. I had to sell 10 more cattle at emergency prices just to thin the herd enough so the rest could breathe. Desperate buyers offered pennies on the dollar for prime beef that would have commanded top dollar under normal circumstances. But Meredith wasn't content with just destroying my livelihood. She wanted to salt the earth behind her. Within a week of the demolition, rumors began spreading through the HOA that I was deliberately polluting their precious resort lake with cattle runoff. Keep in mind, my land is uphill from their artificial paradise, so gravity alone makes contamination impossible. But logic rarely stands a chance against well-planned fear. Meredith launched a campaign, calling an emergency HOA meeting to address what she labeled an environmental hazard caused by irresponsible livestock practices in our area. The meeting took place at Willowbrook Estates Community Center, a building that looked more like an Napa Valley winery than something in rural Texas. Of course, I wasn't invited, but news travels fast in small towns. My friend Clyde Banner, who does plumbing work for many of the residents, filled me in. Meredith stood before 200 homeowners and painted me as some kind of eco-terrorist. She accused my cattle of polluting their groundwater, claimed my outdated facilities attracted vermin, and insisted property values were already dropping because of the agricultural blight next door. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote banning me from using the community well, a system that had supplied water to the area for decades. Losing access to that well was like getting punched while I was already down. My own well was shallow and couldn't support 30 head of cattle, especially during dry spells. For 3 years, I'd been supplementing with community water, paying my share of maintenance costs and never taking more than my allotment. Now, I was forced to drive 50 miles round trip every other day hauling water in a borrowed tank truck, burning through my savings faster than gasoline disappears in a hot engine. The physical exhaustion was brutal, but the financial pressure was even worse. Every gallon of water cost money I didn't have. For cattle I couldn't even shelter properly on land I was beginning to doubt I could afford to keep. Just 3 days after losing water access, I got a notice from the county office that chilled me to the bone: a $2,000 fine for illegal waste disposal, allegedly harming the residential ecosystem. I didn't need to see the signature to know Meredith was behind it. She wasn't just destroying my barn or starving my cattle, she was turning me into an environmental criminal. I called every lawyer listed in the phone book, but every single one gave me the same cold answer: we don't handle HOA disputes. They were scared of Meredith. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about her and me anymore. This was how power crushes people without a voice, weaponizing the very system meant to protect us all to enforce their narrow vision of perfection. I even tried reaching out to the local newspaper, hoping someone might care about the truth. But no one wanted to take on the wealthy development. One editor whispered over the phone, "Unless you've got someone watching your back, you shouldn't make this bigger." In that moment, I understood completely. Truth doesn't stand a chance against money. The system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as intended, shielding those who could afford protection and abandoning the rest. The community's attitude toward me shifted like a landslide. Neighbors who had been friendly for 8 years suddenly treated me like a pariah. The feed store in town started coming up with excuses to refuse me service, just out of what you need or cash only after years of credit. Even in town, people seemed to look right through me. as if ruin were contagious. I realized Meredith had done more than file a demolition order. She had masterminded a character assassination, slowly choking the life out of everything I'd worked for. That's when Clyde Banner showed up at my place with a six-pack of beer and the kind of look that meant he had news. Clyde and I go way back. We worked together on municipal water systems when I was still contracting for the county. He was one of the few in town who knew about my background in water management, and more importantly, he was one of the few who still treated me like a person. "Hank," he said, settling into a folding chair beside my ruined barn, "I've been thinking about your situation, and I've got some information you might find interesting." Clyde had been doing maintenance around Willowbrook Estates since construction started, and he'd noticed something most people overlooked: that gorgeous resort lake Meredith bragged about. It wasn't fed by natural springs or rainfall. The entire thing was artificial, maintained by a complex pumping system pulling water from a county reservoir 5 miles away. More importantly, Clyde explained, the system had emergency drainage valves that could empty the entire lake in case of contamination or repairs. Here's the kicker: those drainage controls were on county land, not HOA property. And according to maintenance records, I was still listed as an authorized technician for emergency water operations. As Clyde spoke, pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed started clicking into place. 10 years ago, when I was contracting for the county, I helped design and install the entire water management infrastructure here. That included pumping stations, overflow systems, and yes, those emergency drainage valves that could turn Meredith's resort lake into a muddy hole faster than you could say property value. My authorization from back then had never been officially revoked, mainly because nobody expected the quiet farmer to ever use it. But legal authorization was legal authorization, and county records would back me up if anyone questioned it. That conversation with Clyde planted a seed that grew over the next few days. I began observing life at Willowbrook Estates, noting when people came and went, when maintenance crews worked on the lake, and when community spaces were busiest. It didn't take long to learn Meredith's daughter was getting married in 3 weeks, with a lakeside extravaganza planned to showcase the community's crown jewel to 300 guests. The wedding was being hyped as the social event of the season, complete with photographers, caterers, and what the local paper called an Instagram-worthy celebration of love and luxury. Meredith's next move was about to unfold. Meredith made it clear she wasn't satisfied with just wrecking my presenter. She wanted to erase my future too. A certified letter arrived, demanding I remove every piece of agricultural equipment within 48 hours or face a lawsuit for ongoing violations of community standards. The letter came from a high-powered law firm in downtown Austin, threatening damages in the hundreds of thousands. Apparently, my temporary cattle shelters and feed storage areas were now deemed eyesores that needed immediate removal. The legal jargon was thick and intimidating, clearly meant to overwhelm a simple farmer and make him feel powerless. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly defeated. Sitting amid the ruins of my barn, clutching that legal threat, I wondered if I should just give up. 8 years of building something from nothing, all at risk because one wealthy woman found my existence inconvenient. I thought about my cattle, the life I'd carved out of screwblound and grit, the pride of honest work and simple living. Then I pictured Meredith's smug smile as the excavator tore through my barn, and something inside me hardened like concrete baking in the sun. That evening, Clyde and I went for a walk that would change everything. We followed the old maintenance road running along county land next to Willowbrook Estates, ostensibly to check on some water pressure issues Clyde had been asked to investigate. The real mission was reconnaissance, mapping the infrastructure that kept Meredith's artificial paradise afloat. We found the main pumping station without trouble, a concrete bunker disguised by landscaping that housed the motors filling the resort lake. More intriguing was a smaller building about 200 yards away, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. The emergency drainage control station looked like an oversized electrical box of the kind of utility setup people pass without a second glance. But inside that unassuming metal housing were valves capable of draining 50 million gallons of lake water in under 3 hours. County regulations required this drainage system as a safety precaution. If the lake became contaminated or posed a flood risk, authorized personnel could quickly empty it to protect downstream communities. The controls were elegantly simple. Turn the valve clockwise to drain, counterclockwise to close. A brass plate inside listed 3 authorized operators, and my name was still there in black and white. As we examined the controls, Clyde filled me in on details that made Meredith's upcoming wedding even more significant. This wasn't just a family celebration, it was a carefully promoted showcase of Willowbrook Estates resort amenities. Real estate agents planned to bring potential buyers on tours during the wedding weekend, hoping to capitalize on the upscale lifestyle the event would highlight. Meredith had spent months coordinating photographers and wedding planners to ensure every detail projected an image of refined luxury. The ceremony was scheduled for 2:30 p.m. on Sunday, timed perfectly for the best natural lighting. That night, I sat alone by the smoldering remains of my barn, staring into the dying embers and reflecting on everything I'd lost. An old cow named Bella rested her head against my knee. I'd raised her from a calf 7 years ago, and she'd stood by me through droughts, storms, and every hardship this land could throw at us. Now she shivered in the dark, a homeless and confused, her familiar shelter reduced to splinters and memories. I stroked her weathered hide and whispered, "They think they can sweep us away like trash, Bella, but they're wrong. Tomorrow, we'll show them who really owns this land." She looked up with eyes clouded by time, as if asking, "Is this really the end?" I had no answer, only a promise. "Tomorrow, you'll be standing in the middle of their field." The wedding timeline became critical intelligence as I began planning what Clyde jokingly dubbed Operation Drain the Swamp. The bride's grand entrance was set for 2:30 p.m. walking down an aisle designed to highlight the lake's sparkling beauty. Cocktail hour would follow immediately, with guests mingling on the lakeside terrace while photographers captured candid moments against the water. Dinner was planned for 5 p.m., a lavish 5-course affair costing more per plate than I spent on groceries all month. If someone opened the drainage valve at, say, 2:45 p.m., the lake would be noticeably lower by cocktail hour and completely drained by dinner time. I spent the next week quietly preparing for what felt like my graduation from the University of Hard Knocks. The legal deadline to clear my property hung over me, but I used the time to document everything, photographing my cattle, recording their conditions, and creating a timeline of events leading here. I also dove deep into county regulations on emergency water system operations, making sure I understood precisely what I was authorized to do and under what circumstances. Knowledge is power, and I planned to wield mine with surgical precision. The night before Meredith's wedding, I walked my property one last time, taking in the temporary shelters and makeshift arrangements that had kept my cattle alive since the barn was demolished. Some of the animals still showed stress, and I knew these cramped conditions couldn't last much longer without serious health risks. Standing there in the darkness, I listened to the distant sounds of wedding preparations echoing across the water and made my peace with what was coming. Meredith wanted to turn this corner of Texas into her personal resort playground, wiping away any trace of the agricultural heritage that had sustained this land for generations. Tomorrow, I was going to show her some things can't be erased so easily. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same water system expertise that helped build this community's infrastructure was about to become the instrument of its undoing. Meredith dismissed me as just another ignorant farmer, as someone whose opinion didn't matter and whose livelihood could be discarded without consequence. She forgot the cardinal rule of small towns: never underestimate the quiet guy who knows where all the pipes are buried. Moreau's wedding was going to be memorable in ways she never expected. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with that perfect brilliant blue sky wedding photographers dream about. From my kitchen window, I watched crews setting up white tents and arranging flowers around Meredith's prized lake. transforming the space into something straight out of a luxury magazine. Catering trucks arrived hourly, unloading enough food and champagne to feed an army. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned for what local media were already calling the wedding of the decade. Meredith had succeeded in creating her perfect resort fantasia, at least for now. I spent the early morning making my own final preparations. Operating the emergency drainage valve required a special wrench, and I'd found the tool tucked away in my old county maintenance kit. The valve key still hung on my contractor's ring, though I doubted anyone at the county even remembered authorizing my access so many years ago. I loaded everything into my truck along with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair. If I was going to watch Meredith's empire literally drain away, I wanted to be comfortable. I also brought my father's old coffee thermos, of the one he left behind before he passed. Sometimes I imagined if he were still here, he'd nod and say, "Son, you're giving this land back to the right people." The drainage control station was perfectly positioned for observation, a clear view of the lake and wedding area, yet hidden behind a grove of oak trees. Clyde arrived around noon, supposedly to help with some final cattle welfare checks before my forced property cleanup. In reality, he was there for moral support and to witness whatever happened next. We drove together down the maintenance road county workers had used for decades. The area around the control station showed signs of recent inspection. Of fresh tire tracks and trampled grass meant someone had been checking the equipment. That was good news. The system was ready for activation. With my authorized key, I opened the valve housing, revealing a simple but elegant control mechanism: a large valve wheel connected to pipes that could drain the entire lake in about 2.5 hours. County regulations required this drainage capability as a safeguard against contamination or structural failure. But the system had never been used in a real emergency. Today, though, would be its first test too, and the emergency was more philosophical than environmental. Sometimes, you have to drain the swamp to see what's really hiding beneath all that artificial beauty. While waiting for the ceremony to start, Clyde and I talked shop, discussing water pressure, drainage flow rates, and the mechanics of the system. The lake held roughly 50 million gallons of water, fed by pumps that could refill it in about 6 hours under normal conditions. But this system was built for emergencies, so when speed mattered more than conservation. If we opened the valve fully, the outflow would outpace inflow by a ratio of 4:1, causing the lake level to drop steadily and visibly throughout the afternoon. Our calculations showed guests would start noticing something was wrong around 3:15, and the lake would be essentially empty by 5:30. At 1 p.m., guests began arriving in numbers that even surprised me. Luxury cars jammed every street, a testament to Meredith's crowd. The guest list read like Austin's: social and financially literate people for whom a $500 wedding gift was pocket change, and weekends in the Hamptons were routine. These were Meredith's people, the audience she'd been performing for since moving to our little corner of Texas. They were about to get a show they'd never forget, though not the one they expected. Meredith appeared around 1:30. Directing last-minute details with the focused intensity of a military commander. She wore a flowing soft blue dress that likely cost more than my entire truck, her hair styled in perfect waves designed to photograph beautifully against the lake backdrop. Everything about her screamed success and sophistication, the image of a woman who transcended her humble origins through careful planning and a well-placed marriage. She moved through the preparations like royalty, inspecting her domain, adjusting flowers and repositioning chairs with the confidence of someone used to getting exactly what she wanted. The bride arrived at 2:15 in a white limousine that probably required special permits to drive on county roads. Even from my distant vantage point, I could see Meredith's daughter was stunning in her wedding gown, a vision of young love and exquisite taste that would grace society pages for weeks. Photographers were already working overtime, capturing every detail for what would surely become a coffee table book of wedding memories. Everything was perfect, elegant, and utterly artificial, exactly the manufactured beauty Meredith had spent months orchestrating. At 2:25, with guests seated and cameras poised, I placed my hand on the emergency drainage valve and took a moment to reflect. The people gathered around that lake weren't evil, they were just privileged enough to forget their luxury came at someone else's expense. But Meredith had made this personal when she destroyed my livelihood and tried to erase me from her perfect picture. Sometimes justice calls for dramatic gestures. Sometimes the only way to reveal the truth is to literally drain away their illusions. At exactly 2:30, as the bride began her walk down the aisle, I turned the valve wheel clockwise and opened the floodgates of karma. The opening notes of the wedding march drifted across the water as I completed the first full turn of the drainage valve. From my hidden spot behind the oak trees, I had a perfect view of the ceremony unfolding just as Meredith had planned. The bride glided down the white carpet aisle with practiced grace, her train flowing behind her like something from a fairy tale. 300 guests rose in unison, their attention riveted on the picture-perfect moment Meredith had carefully orchestrated. Photographers moved discreetly around the perimeter, capturing every angle of what was meant to be a flawless celebration of love and luxury. The water began draining slowly at first, then the water started draining faster. But 50 million gallons don't disappear all at once here even with the emergency valve wide open. The lake level would drop gradually at first, then speed up as hydraulic pressure dropped and flow rates increased. I glanced at my watch at 2:35 p.m. By my calculations, the first noticeable change would come around 3:15. Just as the ceremony wrapped up and cocktail hour began. That timing would give the happy couple perfect wedding photos while making sure the reception turned memorably for completely different reasons. What happened next exceeded even my expectations. At 1:50, just as the ceremony got underway, I saw Meredith frantically checking the lake's edge and making urgent phone calls. She'd spotted the water was slightly lower than the day before and was rushing to fix what she assumed was a minor issue. Within 20 minutes, 4 industrial pumps arrived from Dira Pump Company, the kind of heavy-duty gear used for big construction jobs. "Get these running immediately," I heard her bark into the phone. "I will not have this lake looking like some Texas farm pond on my daughter's wedding day." The irony was richer. Meredith was about to spend thousands to speed up her own disaster. By 2:10, the pump operators had positioned their equipment all around the lake's edge, intake hoses stretching nearly 20 feet into the water. The pumps were meant to circulate water and keep the lake crystal clear for photos, but they also created a strong suction, perfectly complementing my drainage valve. Clyde caught my eye and winked. "We don't need to wait for the valve to do all the work," he whispered. "Let's give them some extra speed." I nodded, watching Meredith's expensive pumps roar to life here, completely unaware they were now working for me, not against me. "Those are some pricey pumps she's got," I murmured. "But now they're doing my job for me." At 2:45, the bride and groom exchanged vows, their voices carrying clearly over the still water. Their words were beautiful and sincere, full of promises about forever and always, almost making me regret what I was about to do. Almost. Then I remembered the sound of my barn collapsing under the excavator's relentless assault, and my resolve hardened like concrete. These people lived inside a bubble of privilege that shielded them from consequence, protected by wealth from the kinds of losses that devastated ordinary folks like me. Today, that bubble was about to burst too, along with their artificial paradise. The ceremony ended at 3:10 with enthusiastic applause and a shower of flower petals floating gently on the breeze. Guests began moving toward the lakeside terrace for cocktails, chatting excitedly about the beautiful ceremony in the stunning setting. Servers appeared with silver trays laden with champagne and hors d'oeuvre that probably cost more than most people's weekly paychecks. Everything was unfolding exactly according to Meredith's elaborate script, except for one small detail no one had noticed yet. The lake was already 6 inches lower than it had been an hour earlier. At 3:20, the first concerned voice cut through the cocktail party chatter. "Is it just me, or does the lake look different?" asked someone near the water's edge, probably noticing the decorative stone border now peeking above the surface. A few other guests glanced over, but most were too busy celebrating to care about something as mundane as water levels. Meredith herself was busy posing for photos with the wedding party, her smile radiant with the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. She had no idea her perfect day was about to turn into a perfect disaster. By 3:30, the changes were impossible to ignore. The lake level had dropped enough to expose muddy banks and reveal the artificial nature of Meredith's resort paradise. What had been a sparkling lake now looked like a drainage pond in severe drought, a dark sediment and debris showing as the water receded. Guests gathered at the shoreline, pointing and murmuring with growing concern. Some older attendees, those who'd lived through real droughts and water shortages, recognized the signs of systematic drainage and began asking pointed questions about the rapid water loss. The wedding photographer was the first to openly panic. His carefully planned lakeside portraits were becoming impossibly the elegant water backdrop replaced by muddy patches. He approached Meredith, clearly distressed, gesturing toward the retreating shoreline and explaining that the romantic sunset photos they'd planned would now feature more mud than water. Meredith's flawless composure finally cracked as she struggled to grasp how her meticulously planned day could be undone by something as simple as water management. By 3:45, with the lake dropping visibly by the minute, Meredith finally understood the full extent of what was happening. Her resort paradise was literally draining away before the eyes of 300 witnesses, turning her daughter's dream wedding into a social media nightmare. The elegant lakeside cocktail reception was now unfolding beside what looked like a construction zone, complete with exposed pipes, muddy banks, and the unmistakable smell of stagnant water and sediment. Guests started taking photos with their phones, but not the kind Meredith had envisioned for this showcase event. At 2:58, just before 4:00, chaos erupted when one of the pump operators came running toward the wedding party, pale with panic. "The pumps are working in reverse," he shouted to anyone who would listen. "We're not circulating water, we're draining the whole lake." Meredith rushed toward Thea. Meredith came running toward the pumping station, her elegant white dress trailing through the grass as she moved faster than dignity should have allowed. "Shut them down. Shut them all down immediately," she screamed, but it was too late. The combined force of my drainage valve and her costly pumps had created a water evacuation system that no amount of panic could stop. At 2:55, I decided it was time to make my presence known. I walked calmly from my observation spot, tipping my wide-brimmed hat to the wedding guests as I approached the chaos around the draining lake. The drainage pipes produced a satisfying rush as thousands of gallons per minute disappeared into the county's drainage system. I positioned myself right in front of Meredith, close enough that her photographer couldn't avoid capturing us both in the same frame. "You took my barn," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, my voice heavy with weeks of built-up frustration. "So I'm taking your lake." Meredith's face shifted from confusion to pure fury as she finally grasped what was happening. "You'll pay for this," she shrieked. I just smiled and nodded toward a guest who was live-streaming the entire disaster on social media. "Let's call it environmental justice," I said coolly. "I lost my memories. You lost your scenery." Sounds fair to me. By 4 o'clock, the transformation was undeniable. Meredith's once pristine resort lake had become a muddy crater filled with confused fish and littered with all sorts of debris, beer cans, lost jewelry, and unidentifiable objects once safely hidden beneath 50 million gallons of carefully maintained water. The elegant stone pathways that had bordered the lake now led only to muck and disappointment. Guests clustered in shocked groups, some nervously laughing at the surreal turn of events, others demanding explanations that no one could provide. The bride, still in her immaculate white dress, stood at the edge of what had been water just an hour before and began to cry, and not delicate tears dabbed away with a lace handkerchief, but deep, heartbreaking sobs born from watching a perfect day unravel beyond anyone's control. Her new husband tried to comfort her while also trying to comprehend how a lake could just vanish during their wedding reception. The wedding party formed a human shield around them, but no one could protect anyone from the grim reality that this celebration had turned into a catastrophe. Meredith responded exactly as I expected someone used to controlling every detail would, like a general commanding troops in retreat. She began barking orders, demanding someone find the source of the drainage and fix it immediately. When the catering staff admitted they had no expertise in water management, she started making frantic calls to county officials, private contractors, anyone who might reverse the disaster unfolding in her backyard. Her voice carried across the now empty lake bed, growing more shrill and desperate with every unanswered call. That's when I decided to make my entrance. I walked slowly from the oak grove where I'd been watching, taking the maintenance road that led directly to the former shoreline. Each step felt like vindication after weeks of humiliation and financial ruin Meredith had caused me. As I neared the crowd of bewildered wedding guests, conversations quieted, and all eyes turned to the man in work boots and blue jeans who stood calmly amid the chaos. Meredith spotted me instantly, her face morphing from confusion to fury in an instant. "You!" she screamed, pointing at me with a manicured finger shaking with rage. "This is your doing, isn't it? You ruined my daughter's wedding." The accusation hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. 300 pairs of eyes fixed on the scruffy farmer who had crashed their elegant party. I let the silence stretch, enjoying the full attention of an audience that had ignored me until 30 seconds before. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and conversational, the tone one might use discussing the weather with a neighbor. "Ma'am," I said, addressing Meredith with exaggerated politeness, "I'm simply performing routine maintenance on the county water management system emergency drainage procedures authorized by my certification from 10 years ago, when I helped design this entire infrastructure." I pulled official documents from my pocket, to the same papers proving my right to operate equipment most people didn't even know existed. Sometimes artificial systems need to be drained for inspection and maintenance. County regulations require this for public safety. The explanation hit Meredith like a physical blow. Her perfect wedding, her social triumph, her display of superior taste and wealth are all destroyed by county regulations and a farmer she tried to erase. The irony was almost scripted. She had used official paperwork and legal threats to demolish my barn and threaten my livelihood, and now official paperwork was ruining her day in return. The difference was, my authorization was legitimate, while her complaints about my farm had been based on nothing but personal bias and social prejudice. "This is illegal," she shrieked, though her voice lacked conviction. "You can't just drain an entire lake. I'll have you arrested." But even as she spoke, I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. She was smart enough to realize that if I was willing to take such bold action in front of hundreds of witnesses, I probably had the legal standing to do it. The emergency drainage paperwork was official county documentation, complete with seals and signatures that couldn't be dismissed as easily as a farmer's complaints about demolished barns. Clyde chose that moment to emerge from behind the maintenance shed, wearing his official county contractor uniform and carrying a clipboard that made him look every inch the government inspector. "Emergency drainage is now complete," he announced to the crowd with bureaucratic formality. "Lakebed inspection will require approximately 24 hours before refilling can begin. We apologize for any inconvenience, but public safety regulations require strict compliance with maintenance schedules." His performance was flawless, turning what looked like sabotage into routine government procedure nobody could reasonably oppose. The aftermath of what local news would soon call the Great Wedding Drain unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche that buried Meredith's reputation under a mountain of public humiliation. Social media mockery spread like wildfire. That evening, all 300 wedding guests left Willowbrook Estates armed with smartphone videos and eyewitness accounts of what quickly became the most spectacular wedding disaster in recent Texas history. Within hours, hashtags were trending, and the story was spreading across the internet faster than wildfire during drought season. Meredith had wanted her daughter's wedding to be unforgettable and widely discussed. She just didn't expect it to be for this reason. The legal fallout arrived as fast as the social media storm. County investigators showed up Monday morning to review my emergency drainage authorization and confirm that proper procedures had been followed. They found everything in perfect order. My certification was current, the drainage had been carried out exactly according to regulations, and the lake was indeed due for its scheduled maintenance inspection. More importantly, their investigation uncovered that Willowbrook Estates had been operating the artificial lake without the necessary environmental permits for over 2 years. Meredith's paradise wasn't just artificial, it was illegal. These environmental violations triggered a cascade of regulatory problems that turned Meredith from HOA president to community pariah faster than the lake had drained. The county slapped immediate fines totaling $100,000 and ordered the lake to remain dry until proper permits were secured and environmental impact studies completed. The Texas Environmental Quality Commission launched its own probe into unauthorized water diversion and habitat destruction. What began as my personal revenge against an arrogant neighbor had snowballed into a regulatory nightmare threatening the entire development's future. Homeowners at Willowbrook Estates quickly realized their property values were sinking faster than the lake level. Real estate agents started canceling showings, and potential buyers vanished like morning mist. The community, once marketed as an exclusive resort destination, was now infamous for environmental violations and permit troubles. Angry residents demanded Meredith's immediate resignation as HOA president and filed threats of lawsuits for the property value losses caused by her illegal lake. The woman who had demolished my barn to protect their property values had single-handedly destroyed them instead. The financial and social pressure broke Meredith far quicker than I expected. Within 6 weeks, she resigned from the HOA and put her house on the market at 20% below what she paid for it. The relentless stress of legal battles, community ostracism, and her daughter's ongoing resentment over the ruined wedding visibly wore down her once impeccable appearance. When I ran into her at the grocery store, she looked like a different persona, exhausted, defeated, wearing clothes from department stores instead of boutiques. She avoided eye contact and hurried away, a far cry from the imperious woman who had ordered my barn demolished. Eventually, the county offered me a settlement that exceeded my wildest expectations. In addition to covering all my cattle losses and barn reconstruction costs, they paid me $150,000 for consulting on the Willowbrook water system investigation. Officially, my knowledge of the original infrastructure design had been invaluable in uncovering permit violations. Unofficially, county officials admitted they'd failed to prevent the disaster by not properly monitoring emergency drainage authorizations. Either way, I finally had the resources to rebuild everything I'd lost to and then some. 6 months after the wedding disaster, I was driving past Meredith's former house when I noticed the for sale sign had been replaced with sold. On a whim, I called the real estate agent and learned the new owner was a private investor planning renovations. When I offered to buy the property at asking price in cash, the deal closed within 2 weeks. Meredith's former palace became my new ranch headquarters, so with panoramic views she had once paid top dollar to enjoy. The irony was so perfect it felt less like coincidence and more like divine intervention. The day I moved in, neighbors stood watching from a distance here, but no one dared say a word. I hung a wooden sign at the front gate, Redford Cattle Ranch, where justice flows. A few weeks later, a journalism student from the University of Austin came to my door, asking if I'd share my story. We're writing about rural gentrification and how land rights get manipulated, he explained earnestly. I nodded and invited him in for coffee. This isn't just my story anymore, I told him, it's about the people who build the land being pushed out by those who just buy it. It's about what happens when money thinks it can erase Historia and what happens when history fights back. The empty lake bed became my favorite pasture. My expanded herd of 75 cattle now grazes on grass growing from soil enriched by decades of artificial fertilization. I kept the stone pathways and decorative bridges not as elegant walkways for resort guests, but as cattle crossings. Where Meredith once hosted wine tastings and social events, I now hold community barbecues for local farmers and county workers. The transformation from artificial paradise to working ranch happened naturally, as if the land itself was relieved to return to its agricultural roots. The final touch was a custom sign commissioned for my ranch entrance, Redford Cattle Ranch, where justice flows. It's visible from the county road, ensuring everyone passing Willowbrook Estates sees my little reminder that sometimes, the quiet guy with dirty boots knows exactly how to level the playing field. Meredith tried to erase the agricultural heritage of our community and replace it with manufactured luxury. Instead, she learned some things run deeper than artificial Lake Isa and that the foundation of rural Texas isn't easily washed away. Sometimes people ask if I feel guilty about ruining a young woman's wedding day. The honest answer: I feel sorry for the bride, who deserved better than to have her special day become collateral damage in her mother's war against reality. But I don't regret teaching Meredith that power and privilege have limits, especially when they come at the expense of honest people trying to make an honest living. She learned you can't just demolish someone's life without consequence, and that sometimes justice flows through the most unexpected channels. Today, as I sit on my porch watching cattle graze where Meredith's lake once sparkled, I'm reminded that the best revenge isn't always served cold. Sometimes it's served precisely at 2:30 on a Sunday afternoon, in front of 300 witnesses, with a legally authorized emergency drainage valve. From whispers to wreckage, Astorys brings it all.